Well, I want to talk about my testimony of how I came to believe in Jesus Christ. I was not always a Christian, of course, but I did believe in God. I think that I've always believed in God since I can remember. I've believed there was a God, and there might be a lot of reasons why. I mean, it's definitely in our culture. My parents, I don't think they disbelieved in God, but they weren't Christians. And I mean, in those days, you could hear people refer to God without any problem. I know that when I was in grade 1, I learned the song in music class, all things bright and beautiful, the Lord God made them all. And I loved that song. I love music. Music has really been a draw for me. And so, yeah, I really loved music. And that song, it made an impact on me of some kind. It was a hymn, really, and yet they were teaching it in grade 1, and you know how far we've come from those days. I remember we did move a lot, and that helps me line up my memories to what house I lived in at the time. So I remember thinking about that song as I walked to school in probably grade 2, the next house we lived in. So it still had a big effect on me. And I think my mother would, she would sing us wonderful lullabies. She had a beautiful voice. She would sing lullabies. And I think they were also religious songs. There was one, Sweet and Low, I think, that had a reference to God in it. And also the French song, Un flambeau, Jeanette Isabella, un flambeau courant au berceau, c'est Jésus, bon gens de Ham. That last line, it is Jesus, good people of the village. So that was a Christmas French hymn. And my mom also, I think, must have loved hymns. I think she was raised in the church, but for intellectual reasons later, she didn't believe those things. She did tell me that she had a private belief in God. This was much later. And but she didn't believe in the deity of Christ or the authority of Scripture. So this was told me after I became a Christian. My father, unbeknownst to me, I did not find this out until at 25 years old, I had become a Christian, called my parents to my house to tell them this. And that's when I found out that my father had actually been to theological college, and he had studied to be a minister in the Anglican faith. But I think he was in his last course. He had one course in Greek left or something, and he just decided he really didn't believe it, and he wanted to be, intellectually honest. He just couldn't go through with becoming a minister. So he became a teacher. And I grew up in ignorance of all this. So, that was my background in believing in God. I asked my father when I was 9 years old, perhaps. I asked him, why can't we see God? And we were sitting in the car, I remember, because he said, well, you can't see radio waves, but you know that, and he pointed to the radio in the car, you know that radio waves exist. So in the same way, he was implying, and I understood that. And so I nodded, okay, so we can't see God. That doesn't mean he isn't there. So my father also had a belief in God. I wasn't explicitly taught anything. My parents were not really didactic people. They didn't try to, I'm sure this was by design. My father's background, maybe he was told too many things that weren't supportable in his eyes. So they didn't try to teach us anything. They really wanted us to grow up and decide for ourselves. Now, another interesting thing about my father is something that changed him after my sister's death. When I was 7, I had a 5-year-old sister who, that's my cat making that noise. Anyway, I had a 5-year-old sister who was hit by a car and died. Very tragic event that happened to me. And it affected us all very deeply. I personally think that Eleanor, my sister, was a gift from God, because my mother was not an affectionate sort. She was more intellectually focused, and she didn't really seem to have emotion, although obviously she's an emotional person underneath. We just couldn't see that. It wasn't expressed. She didn't express emotion, let me put it that way. But Eleanor was a source of love to us. Being mentally retarded, she had Down syndrome. So being mentally retarded, excuse me, she was very, very loving, and we thrived. My brothers and I, my 2 brothers and I, thrived on that affection from her. And so I think that her death was more likely a way of, in removing that gift from us, it really emphasized what she actually was to us. Maybe we wouldn't have noticed how that had affected us when she was smaller. Maybe as she grew up, things would have changed. But she is very, very dear to me, and always will be. And the effect it had on my parents, I wasn't fortunate enough to understand at that age. I was only 7, or even to notice, because when she died, I found out later, after I'd been an adult for many years. My father wrote an article in the newspaper about my sister's death, and this was when I found out the story of what had happened from his point of view. He'd been called up by some ambulance chasers who wanted the business, because it was published in the newspaper, her death, which I didn't realize until even after this article was written. But the ambulance chasers called him up and wanted his business, and he was furious. My father had a very bad temper. He was furious, and in his words, he said something quite unprintable and slammed the telephone down. And he was so furious. He said that anger fueled what he did. He bought some lumber, and in the basement he made a coffin for my sister, and he found out how to become a licensed funeral director with a phone call and paying a small fee, and went to the mortician to get my sister's body to put it in the coffin. And he said it was a strange thing when he touched her body. He knew that wasn't her, that it was just a body, and it wasn't really her. And it was a spiritual event for him. He made my mother touch her body, said that she'd had the same experience. And so he felt that her spirit was beside them as they celebrated it just together, my mother and father and an old clerical friend of his, I suppose from his theological college, not sure, that wasn't mentioned, but he said that he enjoyed the presence of her spirit with him while they were conducting the funeral service. And so this was an experience my father had, which actually didn't bring him to the Christian church. It brought him to an occult church. I think uh, he met someone that was involved in the occult church. And he had a very strange experience. Now, I'm not sure which event came first, but one of the events that got his attention was that some medium in this occult church, described a little girl, which described Eleanor to him, to my father, and said that this little girl was going around the circle patting everyone's knees, which is actually something my sister would do. That was one of her mannerisms. She would pat people and pat their knees. So this got my father's attention. And he also had an experience where some medium was channeling a bishop of the Anglican Church who had died tragically. But before this bishop died, his name was Bishop James Pike, and he wrote a book called The Other Side. So before before he died in the desert, after being lost in the desert, he had been following the occult himself because his son had committed suicide, and he became interested in the occult. And so my father, I think, had these books at home, James Pike, The Other Side, and maybe there was another book. But anyway, the occult experience that my father had was that he went to this medium, and he didn't tell anything about himself. He liked to keep things quiet. I mean, that was a quality of both my parents. I never knew that much about them. They didn't share a lot of things, but I picked up what I did pick up. So at this occult meeting, my father heard the medium's, her voice changing and suddenly claiming to be Bishop James Pike, who was quite popular at the time. This was, I think, mid-60s, perhaps. And he was quite popular, at this author coming out with this book, The Other Side. And suddenly my father, that got his attention, because really he knew a little bit more about Bishop James Pike than the average person. And that's because his father was an Anglican minister, actually Episcopal. It's Anglican in Canada where we live now, but my grandfather was an Episcopal minister in San Francisco, or near San Francisco, many years ago. And James Pike was in the Episcopal Church too. I say Anglican, but in America it's Episcopal. And so my dad knew that his own father was actually a good friend of Bishop Pike, or at least had talked to him several times. And so he knew a little bit more, maybe, about Bishop Pike. And he thought, aha, I can catch this medium out who's pretending to be Bishop James Pike. And so he listened to his spiel. When I asked my father, when he was telling me this story, I asked him what the spiel was about. And he said, oh, I don't know. It was something about the evils of television on children. And so that's what he was apparently talking about. And then maybe there was a time for questions, because my father asked him, he said, tell me, Bishop Pike, what was the relationship between K.L. Sandercock, that was my grandfather, and Henry Olaf House? So that was the question. Can you tell me what the relationship was between these two, K.L. Sandercock and Henry Olaf House? And Henry Olaf House was not a name. My dad said it to sound like a name because he was trying to catch this guy, or this woman, this fake medium. So what's the relationship between these two? But Henry Olaf House was actually a home for alcoholics in San Francisco that my grandfather ran. He ran this house for alcoholics as part of his Episcopal beliefs. And So Bishop Bike came thundering back with K.L. Sandercock was in full charge of Henry Olaf House, which was the right answer, of course. And that threw my dad a bit. You know, he didn't expect that correct answer in this, booming voice to be to come. So then he asked him another question. He said, can you tell me when was the last time, or where was the last time? I'm not sure of the question. Where was the last time you talked to K.L. Sandercock, to his dad? So my dad was asking this assumed Bishop James Pike, when was the last time he talked to K.L. Sandercock? And he wasn't quite sure. He said, oh, I think now it was in Chicago, or was it New York? And he said, I think it was in Chicago. So my dad thought, hey, my father's never been to Chicago or New York. I've got this guy. It's a fake. So then later, he phoned up my grandfather and said, hey, you want to sit down? I have something to tell you. And so he told him about the conversation, and my grandfather responded, hey, I had the longest and best conversation ever with Pike in Chicago. So he confirmed that to him, and he confirmed it. And then he warned my dad. He said, but I would advise against any of this. It's dangerous. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying it's dangerous. That's the opinion I now hold today as a Christian, that the occult is dangerous. So anyway, getting back to my testimony, that's a little background on, my father's beliefs. I mean, he compared himself to Mr. Toad in the story for children called The Wind in the Willows, because Mr. Toad was always Yahoo, out for the next adventure. And that was very much my dad. So he had that kind of a personality where he just was seeking. He was a seeker, and he was into Buddhism, transcendental meditation, pot, LSD, I believe once, although we didn't find this out till much later. He was a teacher, very respectable, very outgoing, friendly, very handsome man. And everybody loved my dad, and he loved life. And so he was after all of these things. I guess having rejected traditional Christianity. I believed in God. In fact, when dating philosophy major who was an atheist, whom I liked very much, I wouldn't, I broke up with him because he did not believe in God. That's how serious, to me, the belief in God was certain. But I know someone else I dated was a Christian and asked me, are you a Christian? And at that time I was 19, and I said, I believe in God, but I don't like to use the word Christian. We did ridicule Christians growing up, mainly because of the televangelists, who were just absolutely ridiculous, in my opinion. And so I wanted nothing to do with Christianity or that word Christian, because I believed in God. I believed God was far greater than the God which was in some little box, that people were just too small-minded to tell me about the 4 spiritual laws. I mean, telling me that, well, it's written in the Bible. Well, what's the Bible? That wasn't carrying any weight or authority with me, because, God was great. There was a God. I knew it, of course, but don't try to put God in any little gospel box, because I will have nothing to do with that. You're being ridiculous. You're being small-minded, and just quite frankly wrong. Had I ever read the Bible? No, I had not read the Bible. So I had run into a few people that were Christians, but I was not having anything to do with the Bible or Christianity. Um, so although this all happened later, when I was dating, that what I when I knew what I believed, it was in God and not in being a Christian. But before all that happened, I was 13 years old. Now, I had spent my life moving quite a bit. We moved a lot. This is due to my father's being like Mr. Toad from Wind in the Willows, I think, although I've never actually asked them why we moved so often. But I remember asking my mother because I saw some people coming out of a church one morning, and I had this desire to go to church. I asked her, "Can we go?" No, no, no. Just no, no reason, just no. No, we're not going to church. So that was when I was about 7. And um, when I was 13, actually when I was 12, my grandmother, the wife of this Anglican minister, had sent me these Christian songs, and I loved them. And the Christian songs were actually Catholic nuns, singing nuns. Now, I loved music, as I told you. I love that hymn. I love my mother singing songs to me at night. And so the Christian hymn and this music, which I'm sure, people would not think is very cool today. It's not cool music at all, but they were singing nuns, but they were very much listening to the they were very much following the style of the times in the late 60s, early 70s, kind of the music of the folk music and all. So these nuns were using guitar to sing, and such beautiful, simple melodies and harmony, but I loved it. And I knew I was paying attention to the words only in retrospect, though, because I remember asking my mother, "What does fidelity mean?" Fidelity was one of the words in the songs. So I must have been listening to the words, but mostly it was the music, I think. And so I loved that music so much. I played it over and over. I'm sure everyone in the family was sick of that music. I think my brother made a lot of fun of me because of that. So that was my mindset at the time, when one day, bright sunny September day, my father comes home from work, and actually it couldn't have been coming home from work. It must have been a Sunday. Yeah, it was a Sunday. He came bounding up the stairs, and he said, "Hey," he was so happy. He said, "Hey, how about coming to church with me tonight?" And I was just struck by this. My father had never asked me to go to church, but it had been a desire of mine, from wanting to go at 7 years old and being refused, and also listening to these Christian songs from the nuns, the singing nuns. So yeah, I was delighted. I was not only going to go to church, but I was going to be with my dad. Those are great things. And then I thought, I've got nothing to wear to church, you know? And then I remembered, in my drawer, there was a blue velvet dress that my grandmother had, the same grandmother that sent me the music, had sent me this dress. And there it was, still in its tissue paper in my drawer, because I had nowhere to wear this blue velvet dress. Never went anywhere. So I went and I put it on. I was ecstatic. I was wearing it. I felt appropriate, and that was another thing in my history was, my mother, was a very practical woman. She dressed us very practically, but I wasn't always dressed like other people. I maybe felt a little bit of, a disconnect from other people in the way I was presented. And I obviously wasn't paying attention to myself either very much. I just followed along, did what I was supposed to do mostly. And so to be wearing what I should be wearing in my own head, my own idea, for church was a great thing. So off we went to church. And in the car, we're almost there. In the car, my father tells me, um, for some reason I don't even now still know, but he said that maybe he was trying to defend the fact that it really was a church. He said that he told me it was an occult church, and I don't even know if I knew what that meant. But he said it was an occult church, but they had actually kicked someone out of that church because that person didn't believe in Jesus. So he was telling me that it was a church that believed in Jesus and the Father, but it was an occult church, which today I would not, be involved in at all, being a very strong Christian and believing like my grandfather did that these things are dangerous. But something happened to me in that church, which I know was God's protection and a way of communicating something to me, which was not communicated in words, but in a vision. And that protection has never actually left me. And that's when I think I came from darkness through to light, because I never, from that moment, I never had those terrible, dark nightmares that I would have even during the day. And my brother and I think he had it too. We called it the black feeling. So also, it was mostly a feeling. There's only one image that is connected with that black feeling, and that's me pushing a boulder up a hill and pushing with great agony, and having it never ending in some way. Either it was rolling back to the beginning and I would have to do it again. It was just eternal pushing a boulder up a hill and this terrible black feeling. So after that experience, which people could argue and which I struggled with for many years, that, hey, that's evil. Anything associated with that building where there was an occult church held, that's evil. Well, now I've learned to disagree with that, because, a physical place, there can be evil associated with that, but that doesn't mean that God can't step in to an occult church and protect someone. And that's what happened. I was protected. It was during the end when there was a prayer, which was a prayer to Jesus and a prayer to God, because that's what they believed as well. During that prayer, I was agreeing with the prayer. I was praying along, and suddenly my whole vision turned blue, this deep, like looking into a deep blue sky. Was depth there. It wasn't just looking at a painting or a picture. It was looking at reality, looking at something. And I also saw a face, a beautiful face, a face of such perfection, a face of a woman who was, growing, but skin like a baby, and just smiling at me like she knew me. And it was an intimacy. It happened in a split second. I opened my eyes and I was so surprised. I said, Dad, I just saw a lady. And he says, you did? I said, yes. He said, you have to tell somebody. And everyone was getting up to leave. It was the end. The prayer was done. Everybody's getting ready to leave. The usher comes up. His name was John Vanderwerf. My dad says, why don't you tell this guy? When I told him, I thought, this guy doesn't understand at all. Because when I told him about it, he said, you must be psychic. Now, immediately in my spirit, I knew that was bollocks. I knew that he did not understand. It wasn't, I thought, if I'm psychic, I would have known, what? I would have known I was psychic, because maybe by definition, I don't know, but I just inwardly, I just shook my head. You've got it all wrong. You don't even understand. So that was my experience. Now, still a long way from Christianity. So after I was married the guy who asked me if you were a Christian. He says, "Are you a Christian?" I said, "Well, I believe in God. Don't like to use the word Christian." That was good enough for him. I mean, he didn't even go to church. And he had a Bible, which is what I decided to read one day because it was 1983. I heard on the radio that 1983 had been declared the year of the Bible. And I thought, I heard the thought in my own head, I don't want to die before I've read the Bible. So I read the Bible. Well, I remembered my grandfather saying to me one day when I was a teenager, and I paid no attention. He said, "I want you to read the book of Luke. You would really like the book of Luke." I didn't see my grandfather, the Anglican minister, Episcopal minister, that often. More so in my later teens because they moved a little closer to us. They moved to Canada from the States. But so I just remembered him saying, read the book of Luke. So after I heard on the radio it was the year of the Bible and I didn't want to die before reading the Bible, I remembered what my grandfather said. And I got my husband's Bible, opened it up to the book of Luke, and I don't even remember reading it. I think nothing drew my attention at all to that. And I got to the end and it said that Luke had written both Luke and Acts. So I thought, oh, well, I'll just keep reading. And I read in Acts. It was only when I got to Paul's story about being on the road to Damascus that it struck me. Whether it was the personal element of I'm writing this and I'm telling you this happened to me, or just the details of the story, I'm not even sure. It was definitely the reality, though, of his words on the page, that he wrote them and he's saying this happened to it, that I knew that it was true. I just knew this happened. And suddenly the image that I had of the Bible being a dusty old book from 2,000 years ago and just like fairy stories for children. In fact, I told my husband, before he was my husband, I actually broke up with him. I broke up with him because I thought this guy's insane because he thinks that the Bible is literally true. He thinks there was really a person named Adam and a person named Eve, and that these are real characters in the Bible. And, I said to him, hey, come on, these are stories for children. You can't believe they're literally true. That was enough for me. That was it. I broke up with him. It was actually my father who changed my mind because this was the first boyfriend my father actually liked, based on, I don't know, him being very polite and bringing me flowers for our first date, stuff like that. Bad reasons, really, but he liked him. So he actually said to me, well, and I had no idea of my father's theological background, of course, by this time, but he said to me, hey, how old is he? 20? He'll grow out of it. Give him a few years. Those were pretty much his exact words. How old is he? 20? He'll grow out of it. Give him a few years. And I had really liked him too. I'd fallen in love with him actually, because I went to high school with him and I kind of knew him and then met him later when I was 19. But I thought about this and I cooled down a bit and I thought, okay, he'll grow out of it. So says my father, having grown out of it as well, little did I know. And but by this time, having read the Bible and thought this is really true, it changed my opinion of what the Bible was. And I don't know if it was at that afternoon or a day later, but I actually felt here, I just felt springing up, like it was a real feeling, more real than physical. I mean, I can't say that it was a physical thing, but it was more physically affecting than physical. It was a spiritual thing within me. My spirit came alive and I could feel it just shooting up and growing. It happened. I could feel it happening. I was overjoyed. I was full of joy. And I relate it to Isaiah 55, where it says, the trees of the field will clap their hands, which seems like a silly thing. Trees don't have hands. They're not clapping. They can't do it. But that was what it was like for me, because everywhere I looked, and not only did I feel the spirit in me, I could see it everywhere. It felt like there was rejoicing going on, not just in me, but outwardly, the trees of the fields clapping their hands with joy. Everything was alive. Everything was real in a way that I never experienced before. And it was just not, it's just not expressible, actually. It's just not expressible. When my husband came, after I'd read the Bible, my husband came in and I wanted to throttle him. I wanted to throttle him because I said to him, you knew this? You knew this was true and you didn't tell me? I was aghast. I could not believe that somebody could know this vital truth and not share it with anyone. Well, I soon learned about how that works. It's not possible to share these things with people. And you end up looking just like a nut and being written off as a nut as well. But it was real. It was real and it was true. And actually, my husband said, you know what? I don't even think I believe this anymore. At that time, he was going to university. I'd talked him into going to university. He was working in a lumber mill before that, and as a first aid attendant in the mill. But he said, I don't even think I believe this stuff anymore. And so I was on fire. I devoured the Bible. I couldn't stop reading the Bible. And I was on fire for the Word of God, for the living, breathing Word of God. It was real. And here I had criticized him for biblical beliefs, and I'd never even read it. So there was some hypocrisy there. We talk about Christians being hypocritical, and it's true. There are many hypocrites that, especially the widely known ones, or the big name people that bring it down. But there are so many, grassroots Christians that are scorned and not believed for those reasons, which is not those aren't good reasons, but that's what happens. That's the way I was. I was against Christians because of the evangelical weirdos on TV and stuff like that. So then I just kept growing in my faith, and a lot of things happened. I have a lot of stories, which, I don't know how long I've been talking now, but I'll have to share them in another video, because I have very compelling stories about how God worked in my life. But that is how I became a Christian.